Welcome to episode 7 of This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Hunter Hallman, here to talk to our experts about the latest 2 busy weeks we've had in the immigration policy world. This week, we'll talk about what Congress needs to do before the end of the year and how DACA factors in, tax reform and its implications for immigrants, and Immigration and Customs Enforcement's sensitive locations policy. At the end of the episode, we'll have Teresa Brown give us a rundown on all the other developments in immigration this week. As always, for real-time updates and analysis on everything we discuss on the podcast and more, go to bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. We have a lot to cover, so let's get right to it. First up, I'm talking to fan favorite Laura Hall, Senior Manager at BPC Action, about what might happen in Congress for the rest of 2017. Laura, what's the latest state of play on an end-of-year package to keep the government running?
Gosh, thanks for that introduction, Hunter. Friday, December 8th is the day when current government funding runs out. So Congress needs to come to some kind of agreement before then. They have several options. Technically, they could pass each spending bill one by one. That's pretty unlikely. They could combine all the spending bills into one large package called an omnibus bill and pass that, or they could pass what's called a continuing resolution, which funds the government at this year's current levels for a certain amount of time. At this point, I think a continuing resolution is the most likely scenario. It gives legislators a little breathing room to continue working out details for what a final package could look like. I think it's likely that we'll see a CR, continuing resolution, into December 22nd, and hopefully some kind of final deal by that date. If they can't reach an agreement by that date, they'll probably have to do another CR into the new year.
So obviously DACA has been in the headlines since September, and we've heard so many different things about how Congress might tackle this issue. Is DACA still in the mix of issues being discussed for the end-of-year package?
It is. I think the general feeling is that apart from a tax reform package, which is one of the things they're working on, the spending package may be one of the last things Congress considers this year. So there are a bunch of issues that have been brought into these discussions that aren't necessarily technically related to spending. DACA is one of them, as well as some other issues like funding for the state children's health insurance program, some Affordable Care Act fixes, and disaster relief assistance for some of the areas that were affected by hurricanes earlier this year. Despite the fact that there are so many of those issues at play, I think there's a lot of appetite and motivation to have some kind of fix for this dreamer population. There have been a variety of bills introduced in both the House and Senate that kind of look to pair some kind of a DACA fix with an increased border security component. And just recently, a group of House Republicans recently sent a letter to Paul Ryan asking him to consider something on this issue before the end of the year. So I think there's kind of a will to get things done.
So this may be kind of an impossible question to answer, but how might the White House meeting on Thursday impact things?
Yeah, it's kind of a toughie. I think it remains to be seen. Personally, I'm not sure any final deal is going to be announced coming out of that White House meeting, but I'm hopeful it can kind of jumpstart conversations about what a final deal could look like. As we mentioned, there isn't much time left to figure something out before the end of the year, so I think we're kind of at the point where leaders from both sides need to kind of step away from their strong partisan positions and start trying to find some compromise to come up with something that could pass both chambers, which is tricky since there are different dynamics in the House and the Senate. The bottom line on all this is that things are still very fluid. There are a lot of moving pieces. I think they need to really start getting their heads together to work on a package that addresses a lot of these issues. It's going to be a challenge, but I think there is optimism that something could be done before this year. But the sooner they start hammering out those details, the better.
Sounds good. Thanks for joining us again, Laura.
Thank you.
Next, we turn to Kenny Megan, a senior policy analyst who works on both the immigration and economic policy projects and is therefore our resident expert on how tax policy and immigration policy intersect. Kenny, what's the current status on tax reform?
So right now, both the Senate and the House have passed separate tax reform bills, and now the process has moved to what is known as conference committee, where both chambers come together and try to hash out their differences and put forth a final package for a vote.
Can you tell us how these tax reform proposals could affect immigrants?
Yeah. Well, first off, let me take a quick step back and address a common misconception, which is the notion that undocumented immigrants don't pay taxes. This is false. The federal government collects hundreds of millions of dollars per year from undocumented immigrants through what is known as individual tax identification numbers, ITINs. And both the House and Senate bills would change eligibility for tax credits based on these ITIN numbers. So the big one would be eligibility for the child tax credit. Now, the child tax credit gives support for low and middle income families with children. So this is a partially refundable credit, which means if you don't have a tax burden at the end of the year, you get part of that credit back as cash. And right now, you can get this credit if you have an ITIN number. So both the House and Senate legislation would change this. The House would be a little more austere in this regard. The House would say the taxpayer now must have a Social Security number in order to claim the credit, which would make undocumented immigrants unable to receive this benefit. The Senate legislation, however, would say ITIN filers can still claim this credit so long as their dependents have a Social Security number. And this is a big difference because a lot of undocumented immigrants have U.S.-born children, and therefore they're U.S. citizens. Mm-hmm. So the Senate bill would be slightly less of a tax increase for undocumented immigrants in this regard.
So how else do the Senate and House bills differ?
In general, the House legislation would lead to tax increases more harshly among undocumented immigrants in general, and this is basically they have a provision that would be largely aimed at DACA recipients. And so President Obama, when he expanded the DACA program several years ago, issued Social Security numbers for a group called the Dreamers who arrived in the U.S. as children. The House legislation would no longer render those Social Security numbers valid to receive other tax credits, namely the American Opportunity Tax Credit, which provides support for college students, and the Earned Income Tax Credit, which basically provides wage support for low-income workers. So again, you would no longer... So DACA recipients' Social Security numbers would no longer be valid to accept these credits. And the IRS would be given what's called math error authority to adjust the returns of those DACA recipients who attempt to claim the credits. Right now, the IRS does not have the authority to do this.
Very interesting. Thanks for breaking it down for us, Kenny. With us now is Raven Quesenberry, who has been interning with the Immigration Project this spring and is here to talk about Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, and something called Sensitive Locations Policy. Raven, what does ICE policy say about where ICE agents can and cannot operate?
Sure, thanks for having me, Hunter. So essentially, the Department of Homeland Security has these policies addressing what they refer to as sensitive locations, or places that they believe ICE agents should generally refrain from taking immigration enforcement actions to enhance public trust and ensure that community members can continue about their daily activities without unnecessary fear. So these include places like churches, mosques, and synagogues, schools, all the way from daycare up to universities, healthcare facilities like hospitals, and any other services like weddings and funerals.
So what do immigration advocates think about the sensitive locations policy as it stands now?
So what we've seen is actually kind of a widespread misconception between the agency themselves and advocates about what this sensitive location policy should extend to. So, for example, over the past few months, we've seen headlines all across the country, from New York City to Los Angeles and even El Paso, that cover unjust enforcement actions occurring at courthouses. And we've seen a lot of backlash, especially from the media and advocacy community, that they don't believe enforcement actions should occur at courthouses. However, the Department of Homeland Security maintains that courthouses are not sensitive locations. They've never been sensitive locations. And actually that it may be safer for the agents to pursue enforcement actions at courthouses, because before entering a government office like a courthouse, everyone entering has to go through screening and metal detectors, so it'll actually be safer for ICE agents to carry out enforcement in these places.
I see. So is there any effort to put these sensitive locations policies, which, as you've explained, is kind of more of a guideline, into actual law?
Yes, exactly. So we've seen bills introduced by Democrats both in the House and the Senate this year called the Protecting Sensitive Locations Act. Essentially what that would seek to do is redefine sensitive locations and clarify what ICE agents can and cannot do in terms of enforcement actions. So they would expand sensitive locations to anywhere school children are present, including field trips and school bus stops, any government buildings, so courthouses and social security offices, and any organizations that provide social services to particularly vulnerable populations, such as children, pregnant women, victims of crime, or individuals with disabilities.
Okay, thanks, Raven. Good to have you with us.
Thank you.
Finally, Teresa Brown is here to talk us through everything else we haven't covered: the verdict in the high-profile case of Kate Steinle, the latest updates on Trump's travel ban, and the latest in apprehensions data.
Sure. So there's been a lot of other immigration news that has happened this week, and as you mentioned, one of the first things we want to cover is the trial of the undocumented immigrant who was charged in the death of Kate Steinle. Just to go back, most of us remember that during the election, President Trump made a big deal about this case where this woman, Kate Steinle, was killed by a bullet from a gun that was used by an undocumented immigrant. This immigrant had been in federal prison, had been transferred from federal prison to a jail in San Francisco to stand for some drug charges. ICE had asked that the individual be detained by the San Francisco Sheriff's Office. They declined based on their sanctuary policy at the time and released this individual. And then subsequently this incident happened. The issue became a very high-profile one. The president used it in the election to try to call for increased enforcement against immigrants. So this trial was against this undocumented immigrant for murder. The state of California charged him with first-degree murder, although the jury was allowed to consider other related charges such as manslaughter. And they reached a verdict this week, and they found him innocent of the murder charges. He was, however, convicted of a lesser charge of possession of a firearm by a felon. This led to a lot of statements, including by the president, that this decision was unjust. However, there are some things that need to be made known about the court case. The evidence in the case supported the fact that Kate Steinle was killed by a ricocheted bullet. The bullet hit the cement and ricocheted and hit her and killed her. So there was evidence that there was not an intent directly to fire at her. There was also mixed ballistic evidence about whether or not the accused had actually fired the gun himself or had gone off accidentally. All of those things led to reasonable doubt by the jury that he had intended to commit murder against Kate Steinle, and that was where the decision lied. So I'm sure jurists will argue this case about whether or not the state should have gone after murder in the first place. He was convicted of this lesser charge that does carry jail time. However, subsequent to the verdict, the Department of Justice has now impaneled a grand jury which has issued a second indictment against the individual, again, for as an undocumented immigrant in possession of a firearm, which is another charge, a federal charge that can also carry additional jail time. So there's more to go on this, but both sides now are using this case again to call for stepped up enforcement. There have been calls on Capitol Hill now for passage of Kate's Law, which was a law that a bill that has passed the House of Representatives, has not yet been taken up in the Senate, that would enhance the jail time that individuals who re-enter the United States after having committed crimes would be subject to. So that's the first big news of the week. The next big news of the week also is in the courts, and that is the Supreme Court ruled that President Trump's latest version of the travel ban can go into effect. So if we remember, this would be, I guess, travel ban 3.0, which included 7 countries that were subject to various degrees of ability to suspend visa applications from those countries, including countries like Chad in Africa and Venezuela in South America, so not all Muslim countries. The Ninth Circuit had issued an injunction against this version based on a district court case in Hawaii. The government appealed the Ninth Circuit decision to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled this week that that injunction could be lifted. The administration could go ahead with the travel ban while the Ninth Circuit is considering the underlying merits of the case. So it's not over, but the administration is moving forward with implementation of this travel ban.
Quick question on that. Is this kind of the first time since the initial, that first night of confusion and kind of chaos in airports that the travel ban has been in effect?
It's been in effect for very brief periods of time in previous iterations based on the back and forth of the court cases, but this will probably be the first time that it is actually in effect, or this version is in effect for a period of time. The injunction has been lifted. And again, we should recognize that the Supreme Court now has 9 justices. It's full complement. The last time it considered the case, it had only 8, and it tied, which meant that the lower court injunction stood. So if this is a preview of what might happen when the case eventually gets back to the Supreme Court, we may see a different decision in the case. And last but not least, the Department of Homeland Security this week issued its year-end enforcement data. This is all of the data on how many people it apprehended at the border, how many arrests inside the country, and how many deportations it had during the last fiscal year, which ended in September. And what the administration has said is that they have increased their enforcement and that they're seeing that. So apprehensions at the border are down substantially from previous years, although frankly, we've looked at the data, they're about where they were in the last couple of fiscal years. But overall apprehensions, as we've been saying for a long time, are at some of their lowest rates since the 1970s. They're between 300 and 400,000 a year. And that is very low compared to the over 1 million we saw, for example, in the 1990s. So relatively, yes, the border rates of apprehension are low. But what we have noticed and what DHS remarks is that the majority of those apprehended are still Central Americans. And over the last several months, we've seen an increase in apprehensions month over month, which means the Central Americans are still coming to the United States, and they are coming now in increasing numbers again. But the interior apprehensions are up as well. So what they're showing is that ICE is arresting more people inside the country. They are claiming that the majority of people apprehended do have a criminal record, although advocates say that most of those crimes are minor crimes. Things like a DUI or traffic violations and or previous immigration-related crimes like illegal entry. So there are some discrepancies in how people are interpreting those data. The other thing, though, that we have remarked on, and we've talked about it here, is that because of the immigration court backlog, those arrested in the interior may not actually be deported at higher rates. They're waiting their turn in court. So it remains to be seen. So overall, yes, it's true this administration has done more on enforcement, at least at the current time, especially on the interior. But we are not seeing the numbers of deportations, for example, that we saw in the early years of the Obama administration at this point in time.
Thanks so much, Teresa, and thanks to all our panelists for another great episode. We're signing off for 2017. This will be our last episode for a while. Listeners, find all of our past podcasts by searching Bipartisan Policy Center on your favorite podcast platform, and don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe while you're there. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you in 2018.